Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Before he touched her hand, he paid off her father's debts. And before she ever said a word, he had already started listening. If you're someone who believes love can grow in silence, in slow mornings, and in second chances, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because some stories take time, and the best ones always do. Not all weddings are beginnings. Some feel more like endings. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The ceremony took place in a private salon on the second floor of a grand estate in Long Island. Gold-trimmed walls, ivory silk curtains, and a chandelier that sparkled without warmth. No music, no guests. Just 2 signatures on legal paper, 2 strangers linked by ink and silence. Vincent Hart stood across from me, sharp in his tailored charcoal suit. His face unreadable, sculpted like something too cold to touch. He didn't look at me when the officiant said our names. He didn't offer his hand. He signed the paper, straightened his cuff, and nodded. Business, concluded. Was 24, a florist's daughter. I'd never dated, never kissed anyone, never expected to marry this way. But my mother was sick, fighting for each breath in a hospital room I couldn't afford. My father had debts he wouldn't explain, only that this marriage would restore the family's name. So I signed. Not for honor. For survival. The room smelled of cedar and old money. There was a stillness in the air like a museum, beautiful, untouched, and unbearably silent. After the officiant left, Vincent gestured toward a small hallway. "You'll stay in the East Wing," he said. "Your belongings have been moved." His voice was low, deliberate. The kind of voice used to making decisions, not conversations. I followed him, not because I knew how to be a wife, but because I didn't know what else to be anymore. As I stepped into the bridal suite, spacious, too elegant for someone like me, I noticed a narrow wooden cabinet near the bed. Ornate. Old. A piece you'd never find in a modern catalog. Something about it called to me. I opened the top drawer. Dust. A faint scent of lavender. And something wedged behind the drawer lining. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. My breath caught. It was a letter. My mother's handwriting. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The ink was faded, but legible. "If you ever find this," it began, "then you've stepped into a place I hoped you'd never have to. I once knew a man named Vincent. If this is the same one, I owe you an apology I can't explain. There are things your father and I never told you, not out of shame, but out of fear. If you're reading this, I hope you'll forgive us for the silence." I stared at the name. Vincent. It couldn't be coincidence. I tucked the letter into the pocket of my dress, heart pounding. I looked at the bed. Not ours. Not yet. The silk sheets were untouched. The fireplace unlit. A glass of untouched champagne sat sweating on the vanity. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands clasped in my lap, as the shadows lengthened on the floor. What kind of man marries a stranger to settle a debt? What kind of woman agrees? I closed my eyes and thought of my mother in the hospital, her fingers curled around mine the night before, whispering, "Stay strong. You were always stronger than you knew." I didn't feel strong. I felt like a ghost in someone else's story. Later, that night I heard Vincent's footsteps pass my door but not pause. He didn't knock. Didn't speak. The house creaked in the quiet. Like it too was uneasy. I pulled the letter out again, read it twice, then pressed it to my chest. Not for answers, but to remember that someone once wrote me from a place of regret and love. And, in that quiet room, beneath the chandelier that sparkled without warmth, I felt something I couldn't name settle inside me. Not hope, but the beginning of a question. Who is Vincent Hart? And why does my mother, gentle, quiet, fiercely protective, owe him anything at all? As I lay on the bed that night, staring at the ceiling trimmed in gold. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I just breathed. One shallow breath at a time. Outside the window, the trees swayed in the autumn wind. Inside me, a single truth settled like dust. This was not the end of something. It was the unraveling. And maybe, just maybe, the start of something I couldn't yet see. The next morning, I woke up in silk sheets I hadn't chosen, in a room I hadn't earned, in a marriage I barely understood. The air was still, cool with autumn, and the city beyond the estate buzzed faintly in the distance like a life I was no longer part of. I dressed quietly and made my way downstairs. The house was cavernous. My footsteps echoed. I passed oil paintings I didn't recognize and vases that looked like they belonged in a museum. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock ticked. Every sound in that house felt like it needed permission. Vincent wasn't home. A staff member, silent, efficient, handed me a phone and said, "The hospital called." My heart dropped. I rushed to the hospital, still wearing the pale wool coat I'd brought from home, the sleeves too long, the pockets fraying. My mother lay sleeping, her breath shallow but steady. And beside her bed stood something new, a medical machine, sleek and unfamiliar. When I asked about it, the nurse smiled gently. It was installed early this morning, covered in full, anonymous, benefactor. I knew. Somehow I knew. It was him. I sat beside my mother, holding her hand, tracing the fragile lines of her fingers with my thumb. I wanted to feel anger that he hadn't told me, that he was doing this not as a husband, but as an obligation. But all I felt was a strange kind of warmth, not comfort, but care, delivered in silence. That evening, I returned to the estate. It was nearly dark. A fire glowed softly in the library, though no one was there. On the side table, a cup of tea had gone cold. Chamomile. My favorite. I didn't see him until later that night. He came in through the back hallway, briefcase in hand, rain on his coat. I froze. We hadn't spoken since the wedding. He paused, looked at me, and for the first time, his eyes softened. Just slightly. Enough. "I heard about your mother," he said quietly. "Is she stable?" I nodded. "Yes, thanks to you." He didn't reply, just gave a small nod. Then, after a beat, "No one should have to worry about whether their mother can breathe." And just like that, he walked past. His footsteps receded, but something stayed behind. A presence. A shift. That night, I sat at the small desk by my window, staring out over the lawn, rereading the letter from my mother. The questions spun. What did she mean? What had happened between them, if anything? And why did he never say? I opened the bottom drawer and found a blank notebook. The kind with heavy cream pages. I began writing, not to figure him out, but to remember myself. The girl who used to string flowers into crowns. The one who sat on the kitchen counter while her mom hummed old folk songs. The one who once believed love had to be loud to be real. I wrote until my hand cramped, then tucked the notebook beneath the drawer lining like the letter had been. Theory. Next morning, I woke to a small tray outside my bedroom door. Toast, a soft-boiled egg, and a single note in neat handwriting. For strength. V. I stared at the note for a long time. Vincent Hart was not a man of many words, but every silence I was starting to learn was saying something. Later that week, I returned to the hospital. My mother was stronger. When I told her about the machine, about the anonymous donation, she closed her eyes as if in pain. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered. "Told me what?" She didn't answer, only pressed my hand with hers and said, "Don't be afraid to look for the truth, Mai. even if it changes everything. That night, I walked past Vincent's study. The door was ajar. I paused. He sat alone at his desk, his back to me. A photo frame sat beside his keyboard, faced away. Before I could stop myself, I knocked. He turned, surprised. I wanted to say, "Thank you," I said. He blinked, then stood. "You don't owe me that." "I think I do." We stood in silence. The fireplace behind him cast long shadows. Finally, he said, "I don't want you to feel like a prisoner here." "I don't," I said quietly. "Not tonight." It wasn't much, but it was the first moment that didn't feel like a transaction. Just two people in a house too big for either of them. And for the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel entirely alone. There are sounds you never forget. The rattle of a drawer opening in a quiet room. The rustle of a letter older than your grief. The thud of your own heart when you read a name you never expected to see again. That morning, the house felt heavier. The early light cut through the drapes in long gold bars, slicing the bedroom into shadows. I hadn't slept well. Something in my chest was unsettled, restless. That letter from my mother. It hadn't left my nightstand. I'd read it at least 10 times since finding it. If this is the same one, what did she mean? Vincent Hart had never mentioned knowing my family. In fact, since our wedding, he'd spoken maybe 30 words to me. Polite, precise, and always necessary. Not cruel, but distant, as if being close required more risk than he was willing to take. I stepped into the hallway and walked down to the main sitting room, where the scent of polish and cedarwood always lingered. I don't know what made me open the antique chest, tucked against the wall near the piano. Maybe I was searching for something. A piece of myself, a piece of him. Inside were old documents, some yellowing newspaper clippings, and at the bottom, another letter. Different handwriting. Masculine. Blocky. To my father. I read it standing there, breath catching with each line. "I've done what I can. But this is the last time, Alan. You owe me the truth. Not another favor." The signature was blurred, but the initials were clear. VHI sat down on the piano bench, the letter still in hand. 1,000 possibilities spun in my head. My father. My father had known Vincent. More than that. He had asked him for help. More than once. Why hadn't they told me? Later that day, I visited my mother again. Her color was better. The nurse said she'd been asking for jasmine tea, her favorite. I brought some from the kitchen, and as we sat, I finally asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Did you and Dad know Vincent?" Her eyes flickered. She set the cup down. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," she whispered. "Yes, years ago, before you were born. But why didn't anyone say anything? Why did you let me walk into this marriage blind?" Tears welled in her eyes, but didn't fall. "Because your father made mistakes. Ones we hoped you'd never have to pay for. And yet here I am," I said, too sharply. She looked at me. Not hurt, just tired. "Vincent wasn't always cold. Once he saved your father's life, and our family's. We thought that debt had been buried." I didn't know what to say. My mother reached into the drawer beside the bed and pulled out a small silver pendant. It was old, worn. Inside, a faded photograph of a man I didn't recognize. And Vincent. Younger, eyes softer, smile unguarded. I kept this because I knew someday the past would catch up. Back at the estate, the evening passed in near silence. I couldn't bring myself to look at Vincent. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't yet know what I was seeing. A stranger? A protector? A man haunted by promises made in a different lifetime? Dinner was laid out in the dining room, just the two of us. He pulled out my chair, sat across from me. The silence was thick, but not hostile. Finally, I said, "You knew my father." He looked up slowly, met my eyes. "Yes. Why didn't you tell me?" He hesitated. "Because I didn't want to define us by that." "Define us? You mean this contract?" His jaw tightened. "I mean what's left after it ends." We didn't speak after that. Not for the rest of the meal, but something had broken open between us. Not in anger. In truth. That night, I returned to the wooden cabinet. I placed both letters inside, the one from my mother and the one to my father. I closed the drawer gently, then stood for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me. Somehow, I no longer felt like I was trespassing in Vincent's house. I felt like I'd stumbled into a story I was always meant to finish. It rained for 2 days straight. The kind of rain that tapped against the windows like a reminder, steady, unrelenting. The kind that blurred the world outside into shades of gray and made time feel suspended. I sat by the front parlor, watching the drops race each other down the glass. My fingers wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea I hadn't touched. Vincent had been gone since morning. A meeting, according to the brief message his assistant had left. I didn't ask where. I didn't ask when he'd return. But I listened for his car anyway. Around noon, the hospital called. My mother had taken a turn. I didn't stop to think. I didn't change clothes. I grabbed my coat and keys and ran through the rain to the car. By the time I reached the hospital, my coat clung to my skin, and my shoes squelched with each step. She was stable by the time I arrived, but weak. Her face looked pale against the sheets, her voice barely above a whisper. I held her hand, combed her hair back, wiped the damp from her brow. "She kept asking for you," the nurse said gently. I nodded. "I'm here now." An hour passed before I noticed the second cup of tea on the bedside table, still warm. The nurse followed my eyes. "Mr. Hart was here an hour ago, sat with her until she calmed down." My breath caught. "He didn't say anything," she added. "But..." He looked worried. I stood motionless for a moment, staring at the untouched chair beside the bed. My mother was dozing again, her breaths shallow but even. I pulled the hospital blanket higher over her shoulders and kissed her temple. Back at the house, the storm had grown fierce. Trees bent beneath the wind, and the windows groaned. As I stepped inside, the foyer lights flickered, then steadied. He was in the kitchen. Vincent stood at the stove, back to me, sleeves rolled up, hair damp. He turned slightly as I entered. "I had them bring in soup," he said simply. "You'll catch your death running around in that storm." I opened my mouth to answer but found no words. Instead, I moved toward the small radiator in the corner, shivering despite myself. A towel appeared in my hands. Then, gently, a second one pressed against my hair. His hands, tentative, unfamiliar. "I didn't expect you to be at the hospital," I whispered. "I didn't expect to stay," he said. The towel moved slower, then stopped. His hands lingered at the base of my neck. She looked peaceful when she finally slept. I closed my eyes. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind outside and the soft tick of the wall clock. "She used to hum to me when I was sick," I said. "Songs in a language I barely remember. I used to think she could heal anything, just with her voice." "She's strong," he said. "I see where you get it." I laughed softly. "You don't know me well enough to say that." His voice was quiet. "I know enough." When I turned around, he was closer than I expected. His shirt was wrinkled, damp at the cuffs, his expression unreadable. But there was something different now, something softer in the lines of his face. I didn't want you to marry me, he said suddenly. Not like that. Not through a contract. Then why did you agree to it? Because your father asked, and because when I saw you, I realized I'd been waiting for a reason to let go of the man I'd become. We stood in silence, those words hanging between us like fragile glass. I reached out, without thinking, and laid my hand on his. It was the first time I had touched him with intention. The first time it wasn't out of ceremony or duty or formality. Just touch. Human. And honest. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. His eyes never left mine. Thank you, I said. For being there. For her. You don't need to thank me. I do. Not because I owe you, but because I see you trying. And I think you've been trying for a long time. His jaw clenched slightly, as if he wasn't sure what to do with that truth. Then, gently, his hand turned beneath mine and held it. Outside, the storm began to slow. The windows were still streaked with water, but the sky had softened. The light was low and golden, like the sun had been waiting just behind the clouds. He released my hand before the moment could stretch too far, and turned back to the stove. Dinner will be ready in 10, he said. I smiled, stepping back, but my hand still tingled from where he had held it. That night, as I lay in bed, I watched the shadows dance across the ceiling. The rain had stopped. The world outside was still. Quiet. But inside, something had begun to move. Something I didn't yet understand, but no longer feared. The next morning arrived quiet and silver, like the world was holding its breath. I woke to a sky still smudged with the memory of last night's storm. There was a stillness in the house that felt heavier than usual, as though it too was waiting. I wandered to the front door without thinking, barefoot on the hardwood floors. Something had been left on the stoop. A parcel. Small. Wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. No return address. Inside was a letter. A real one, pen on paper, the kind that trembles slightly with age. The handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. I hadn't seen it in years. I sat on the foyer bench, the letter resting in my hands for a moment before I opened it. If this reaches you, then I am trusting Vincent kept his promise, to protect you, even from me. I'm sorry I left the way I did. I didn't know how else to protect you and your mother. I made too many mistakes. And Vincent, he stepped in more times than I deserved. This marriage, though it began with debt, might carry something purer than either of us understood. Don't walk away too fast. You might find he's been waiting for you longer than you've known. And if you see your mother smile again, know that it was worth it. Dad, tears came slowly. Not the sharp, gasping kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that roll down the neck and disappear into your collar before you notice. I found myself standing in the kitchen, letter still in hand. Vincent was there again, always at the stove lately, as though the kitchen had become the only safe place between us. He looked up. You okay? I held the letter out wordlessly. He read it slowly. His brow tightened, then softened. When he looked at me again, his eyes held something I hadn't seen before. Sorrow. I didn't know he'd write, Vincent said finally. He sent it weeks ago, had it delivered through someone I trusted. You protected him, I said. I owed him that. And I owed you, more than I gave. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked past him and placed the letter on the windowsill. We stood in the soft light of the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee warming the air. He said you'd been waiting, I said. I was, Vincent replied. But not just for you. For something to matter again. For something real. The kettle hissed. We sat at the small breakfast table barely 2 feet between us. Vincent slid a mug toward me. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know," I said. "I think I was trying to prove to myself I could still be good," he continued. "That I could carry someone else's weight and not break." "Did you?" "I don't know." We sat in silence. Not awkward, not tense. Just full. Like something important had been said without needing translation. Later that afternoon, I returned to the hospital. My mother was awake, sitting up in bed. Her cheeks had color again. Her eyes sparkled, faint but familiar. She saw the letter in my hand. "He wrote to you, didn't he?" she asked. "Yes," she nodded. "He was never good at saying the right thing, but he never stopped trying to do the right thing." We talked for hours, about the early days, about the debts, about Vincent. She didn't paint him as a saint, but she called him steady, and in her voice, I heard something close to trust. "I think he's still becoming," she said. "We all are, in some way." I stayed until the sky turned orange. When I came home, Vincent was outside, tending to the flower beds near the side porch. I watched him for a moment from the driveway. There was nothing elegant about the way he worked. His sleeves were pushed up, dirt under his fingernails. And yet, he looked more human than I'd ever seen him. I stepped beside him without a word, crouched, reached for a root he'd missed. He looked up, surprised, then smiled. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a confession. But it was a beginning. That evening, we shared dinner in the garden under the string lights I hadn't realized had been hung. The air was cool, the cicadas quiet, and in that stillness, I realized something. Maybe healing didn't come all at once. Maybe it arrived in letters, in mugs of coffee, in unspoken glances across garden beds. Maybe, just maybe, I was home. A few days passed. The weather shifted. A warm breeze swept through the garden, carrying the scent of blooming rosemary. Spring was pushing through the chill, and with it, a softness neither of us had the words for. Vincent and I moved like people who shared a rhythm, but hadn't yet agreed on a melody. We passed one another in doorways, exchanged quiet smiles, and sometimes, without meaning to, paused for a second longer than necessary. One morning I found him in the music room. The room had been silent since I'd arrived, but now, the lid of the piano was open, and Vincent's fingers hovered over the keys. He looked up as I stepped in. "I didn't know you played," I said. "I used to." He touched one note. Soft, almost reluctant. "My mother taught me," he added, "before everything got complicated." There was so much I didn't know about him, and yet, I no longer felt like a stranger in his presence, just someone waiting for a door to open. I sat beside him on the bench, not touching, just close enough to share space. "What happened?" I asked gently. He let out a breath. "She left when I was 16. My father was powerful, but cold. She didn't say goodbye." I turned toward him. "Is that why you've kept your distance from people?" He gave a dry laugh. "Maybe. Or maybe I just didn't believe love stayed." I didn't answer. Instead, I reached out and played a note of my own. We sat like that for a while, 2 hands on an old piano, notes hanging in the air like unfinished thoughts. That evening, I made dinner. Simple things: rosemary chicken, warm bread, citrus salad. It wasn't elegant, but it was mine. Vincent appeared in the doorway, tie loosened, eyes tired. "Something smells incredible," he said. "It's just dinner," I replied. We ate together, candles flickering between us, and for the first time, we talked, not about debts or illness or the past, but about music, about favorite books, about the first time each of us realized the world wasn't fair, and what we did with that knowledge. "I was 10, he said, My father told me never to show weakness, that it would be used against me. I believed him for too long. And now? I asked. He met my gaze. Now I think weakness might be the only honest part of us. After dinner, we cleaned the kitchen side by side. No words, just dishes and soft hums and occasional glances that said more than dialogue ever could. Before bed, I stood in the hallway, hand on my doorknob, and asked without turning, "Did you ever think about what we'd be without the contract?" Vincent's voice came low, steady. "I think about it every day." I turned, heart quickening. "And? I wonder if I would have found the courage to love you, without needing an excuse to keep you close." My throat tightened. I wanted to say something, anything, but instead, I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. Not for answers, not for promises, just to feel him breathe. He froze for a second. Then his hands came around me, steady and certain. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. In that moment, I understood. Love doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in the form of a quiet hug in a dim hallway. And sometimes that's enough. When we finally pulled apart, Vincent cupped my cheek gently. "Good night, Mai." "Good night, Vincent." I walked back into my room with a full heart and an empty mind. For the first time, I didn't need to figure everything out. I just needed to feel it. The envelope came on a Tuesday. Simple, cream-colored, tucked under the brass dish on the entryway table as if it had always belonged there. I knew what it was. Before I opened it, the contract was over. 1 year. That's what we agreed. 1 year of paper-thin boundaries and polite distance, of living like strangers who sometimes smiled in passing. Only, it wasn't that anymore. Not since the hospital. Not since the piano. Not since the hug in the hallway where I heard his heartbeat as loud as mine. Still, I read the letter. Vincent's legal team had signed it, finalized it. There was no note from him, no words. Just the quiet end to something that had, ironically, become the only real thing in my life. I left the envelope on the mantel. All day, I walked past it, folded laundry, wrote in my journal, visited my mother, who now smiled more than she coughed. When I returned home near sunset, Vincent's car wasn't in the driveway. I didn't eat. I didn't change. I sat in the quiet of the living room and stared at the envelope as the sun lowered, its gold spilling across the wood floor like a final benediction. At some point, the front door opened. I didn't turn. He entered slowly, then paused behind me. I could hear the breath catch in his chest. "You read it," he said. I nodded. "It doesn't have to mean anything," he added, voice low. "Not if you don't want it to." I stood and faced him. His jacket was still on. He looked like he hadn't slept. "It means everything," I said. His eyes searched mine. "Do you want to go?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded page. My own letter. One I had written the night before our wedding. I'd forgotten I had it. He took it from me and read silently. I watched his brow shift, his lips pressed together. "If this becomes my cage," I had written, "I'll survive. But if it ever becomes something more, I hope I have the courage to stay." He folded the paper slowly, held it like something precious. "Stay," he said. "I'm not staying out of pity," I warned. He stepped closer. "I would never want that. I'm not staying because I'm afraid. I know. I'm staying because I believe in who you are becoming." His eyes dropped for a moment, as if the weight of those words bent him slightly. When he looked back up, there was no barrier left. "I've been afraid to hope," he whispered. "But you, every moment you stayed, every word you didn't say, you made me hope again." I closed the space between us. I want to build something real, I said. Not out of paper or obligation, but from who we are now, who we could be. He reached out slowly, like touching me might undo him. But when his hand cupped my face, it felt inevitable. Then stay, he murmured. But not as my contract. As my choice. A pause. And if you'll have me, he added, voice almost breaking, as yours. I leaned into his palm. I already do. The fire in the hearth flickered softly beside us. Somewhere in the kitchen, the kettle began to hiss, but neither of us moved. Not yet. We had time now. Real time. No conditions. No expiration dates. Just the quiet, extraordinary start of something we had both thought we'd never deserve. And for the first time, I saw Vincent not as the man who signed my future into existence, but as the one who now handed it back to me, open and whole. It began slowly. No declarations. No grand ceremonies. Just the quiet rhythm of days settling into one another. Vincent started making breakfast. It was never perfect. Too much salt, uneven toast, once even burnt eggs. But he tried. Every morning. The kitchen, once cold and staged, now smelled of coffee and music. He had begun playing jazz on the old radio by the windowsill. I started leaving notes. Nothing elaborate, just a line or two beside his mug. Good luck today. You slept through your alarm. Yes, I saw you steal a cookie. Kept every one of them in a drawer by his desk. I found them once, folded neatly in a small wooden box. My mother visited often now. Her strength was returning. She smiled more, asked fewer questions, laughed at Vincent's dry jokes like they were comedy gold. She brought cuttings from her garden, claimed the back porch as her new favorite spot, and even insisted on teaching Vincent how to brew proper tea. He listened. Patiently, attentively, like he'd never had someone care enough to correct the little things. I watched him change, not drastically, but meaningfully. He laughed more, listened more, took evening walks with me down the gravel path that looped behind the estate. Sometimes we walked in silence. Sometimes we spoke about nothing. But always, we held hands. One evening, just as the sun dipped beneath the hills, we sat under the pergola, light fading around us like an old song. He turned to me, eyes soft. Do you regret it? He asked. No, I said. Not even a little. Nodded, like he'd been holding his breath for a year and had only now let it go. You changed me, he said. I didn't mean to. I'm glad you did. I looked around. The garden my mother had revived. The string lights Vincent had hung without telling me. The faint hum of crickets in the grass. Everything felt enough. Later that night, I found a new journal waiting on my pillow. Cream leather. Embossed initials. A ribbon bookmark tucked into the first page. Inside, a single note. Write the life you want. I'll meet you there. Six wrote the first line immediately. This home was once built on silence, but now it holds laughter, music, and morning light. Vincent came in quietly, lay beside me, and reached for my hand. No words. Just his thumb tracing the inside of my wrist, steady as breath. We didn't need vows to know what we'd become, not just partners, not just survivors of what once was, but a family. And as I rested my head on his shoulder, listening to the soft hush of the world outside, I felt it in every part of me. We weren't perfect, but we were finally real, and that was more than enough. If this story touched something quiet in you, something about second chances, or slow, healing, or simply the hope that love can still find us, consider giving it a like. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, ones that take their time and mean what they say, I'd love for you to subscribe. Sometimes, the gentlest stories stay with us the longest.